Hello, everybody. Professor Barth here, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome to part 4 of our section on John Locke, itself part of a larger series on the foundations of Western political thought. We're going to take a look today at the forms of civil government. If you haven't seen earlier videos like part 3, where we took a look at the state of nature and the transition to civil government, why do we have civil government according to John Locke? Part 2, the historical context of John Locke, and part 1, the introduction, you're going to want to do so. Of course, we are analyzing and taking a close look at Locke's famous second treatise of government. And as a reminder, we saw this last time, but repeat. Locke defines freedom as, quote, not a liberty for everyone to do what he desires. That's libertinism. Rather, freedom under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society, and made by the legislative power erected in it. I'm going to talk a lot about that today. The legislative power. A liberty to follow my own will in all things where the rule prescribes not, and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. That is freedom under the Lockean framework. Now, we saw last time that the reason why men form government, the reason why they unite into what Locke calls civil society is, quote, for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which Locke calls by the general name of property. In a state of nature, those things are too uncertain, and so men unite for the mutual preservation of those three elements. Now, there are two chief powers in government, according to Mr. Locke. The legislative power and the executive power. The legislative power receives its authority from the community, and as such, it is the supreme power within the government, according to Locke. Now, interestingly, you'll take a look at these chief powers, and you'll say, where is the judiciary? And Locke leaves the judiciary out. There's nothing in the second treatise of government that speaks of an independent judicial branch. So here, in a sense, we see two branches of government. Now, Locke allows for judges, of course, and a judicial system, but it's unclear where the judicial system falls. Is it under the legislative? Is it under the executive? Is it accountable to both? But from Locke's point of view, there is a separation of powers, but not three branches. What the chief separation of powers in Locke's system is legislative and executive. And as in a certain sense, the judicial element permeates the entire government, but we don't have in Locke's system an independent judiciary per se. Just a little side note there in case you were wondering. The first and fundamental positive law, Locke says, is the establishing of the legislative power. This is the most important thing to do right at the outset. When you're forming a civil government, you've got to establish the legislative power. It is the supreme power within the government. It is the lawmaking power. Nevertheless, it is not, its power is not limitless. It is a limited power. For those supreme within the government, the legislative power, quote, is not, nor can possibly be, absolutely arbitrary over the lives and fortunes of the people. Their power, in the utmost bounds of it, speaking of the legislature, is limited to the public good of the society. So there's a built-in limitation on the power of the most supreme element within the government. Limited to the public good of the society, it is a power that hath no other end but preservation and therefore can never have a right to destroy, enslave, or designedly to impoverish the subjects. There is no right within the legislature to do any of these things. This is a limited power. Here we see a distinction from the Hobbesian system, where once the Leviathan is created, the Leviathan has a sort of absolute power. Here, this is a limited power for even the supreme branch of government, the legislature. Why is it limited? Well, Locke explains, natural law is still in effect. Natural law is not surrendered at the transition from the state of nature to civil government. No. Locke says, the obligations of the law of nature cease not in society. The law of nature stands as an eternal rule to all men, legislators, as well as others. So this is this eternal rule supersedes the power and authority of even the legislature, which is the supreme branch. It is a fixed standing rule. As we saw in part 3, Locke argues that this law of nature derives from none other than God himself. And because God is immutable and God is perfect and holy and totally sovereign over his creation, God has the right to establish this law of nature. And this law of nature, therefore, is fixed, it's objective, it's immutable, it's not a social construct, it's not a product of Western civilization or whiteness, or it's not subjective to Anglo political thought. No, this is a law, again, whose authority derives from God, the Creator, that applies everywhere to all men and to all institutions, including the most supreme branch of government, the legislature. So this, again, limits the power of government. Among those limitations, Locke says, quote, the legislative or supreme authority, maybe not so supreme, right? Again, only supreme within government. The legislative or supreme authority cannot assume to itself a power to rule by extemporary, arbitrary decrees, meaning decrees that are just suddenly put out there and without any preparation, no announcement, just arbitrarily dealt out. The legislative does not have that power. Rather, they are bound to rule, quote, by promulgated standing laws and known authorized judges. So there's the judicial power there. It doesn't explain who authorizes the judges. Is it the legislature? Is it the executive? Is it a combination of both? The point here is the rule of law, standing laws that are known to all, formulated and approved in a constitutional manner. Locke says that absolute arbitrary power, or governing without settled standing laws, is not a legitimate form of government. Now, anytime you have a form of government that governs by arbitrary power, that governs outside the rule of law, you're no longer dealing with a legitimate form of government. Another limitation that Locke emphasizes in this second treatise. Quote, the supreme power, meaning the legislative, cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent. This is again, you don't find anything like this in Hobbes. This is a strong limitation on the powers of government. Cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent. For without this limitation on governmental power, the people have no property at all. For I have truly no property in that which another can by right take from me when he pleases against my consent. If the legislative, the parliament or Congress, can simply at will take my property, then I have no property at that point. And then it becomes tyranny, governed by the arbitrary will of this despotic government. Now, what does this mean for taxation? Does this mean that taxation is theft, as the libertarians like to say? No. Taxation is not theft. Taxation is legitimate. Why? Locke says, because, quote, governments cannot be supported without great charge. You need money to run a government. And so it is fit that everyone who enjoys his share of this protection should pay out of his estate his proportion for the maintenance of it. But still, it must be with his own consent, that is to say, the consent of the majority. So here we have that democratic element in Locke. Again, with Locke, we don't have just pure majoritarian democracy. Why? Because that eternal rule called natural law, God's law, restricts its power. As we'll see, the people also, the power of the people is supreme over the power of the legislature. We'll get to that in a moment. But here, so long as the legislature is acting within its legitimate purview, majority rule has its place. And Locke says if the legislature, by consent of the majority, passes a tax, it is perfectly legitimate, so long as it's with the consent of the majority. This was the main problem, the chief problem that the colonists had with the Stamp Act. I have one more before I get to that. Locke says, quote, if anyone shall claim a power to lay and levy taxes on the people by his own authority, and without such consent of the people, he thereby invades the fundamental law of property and subverts the end of government. So, taxation is legitimate only with the consent of the people through a democratic process. If anybody levies taxes on the people without their consent, this is an invasion of the law of property and subverts the end of government. On the eve of the American Revolution, the colonists, when Parliament passed a new law of revenue, the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed the American colonists directly from Parliament, there was an uproar about it. Why? Because the colonists had no representation in Parliament. This was taxation without representation, and they responded with the most with utter outrage. If you know anything about the history, mobs, violence. The governor of Massachusetts, the governor's mansion was ransacked. What was the big deal? Actually, there was a stamp tax in England, and the people in England were fine with it. And actually, it wasn't that heavy of a tax. It was, it was a bit of a burden, but not terrible. And in fact, the American colonists were one of the least taxed people in the world. But it was taxation without their consent. And thus, as Locke and the colonists argued, this act invaded the fundamental law of property and subverted the end of government, so that really you have no property at all then if some body in which you have no representation can tax you at will. So Locke summarizes the powers of the legislative. First, they are to govern by promulgated, established laws. These laws are to apply equally to all people, rich, poor, people who are in favor with the government, people who aren't favored by the government. Secondly, these laws ought to be designed for no other end ultimately but the good of the people. And the good of the people, this would be interpreted through the law of nature. Thirdly, they must not raise taxes on the property of the people without the consent of the people. These are the three stipulations that Locke places there. Again, you can see why the colonists took such great exception to the Stamp Act. Taxes must only be raised with the consent of the people, or else you have no true property rights. So, within the state, then the state apparatus, the legislative power, is the one supreme power to which all the rest are and must be subordinate. There's a reason why in our Constitution, Congress is number one. Article 1 is addresses the powers of Congress. Locke, in like manner, places within the government the legislative power as supreme. Nevertheless, legislative power is subordinate to natural law, and the legislative power is also subordinate to the people. The people are a power that is above that of the legislative power. Look what Locke says here. Quote, the legislative being only a fiduciary power is a power that is entrusted to do a certain and particular thing. The legislative being only a fiduciary power to act for certain ends, there remains still in the people a supreme power to remove or alter the legislative when they find the legislative act contrary to the trust reposed in them. For all power given with trust for the attaining an end being limited by the end, whenever that end is manifestly neglected or opposed, the trust must necessarily be forfeited, and the power devolve into the hands of those that gave it, who may place it anew where they shall think best for their safety and security. Now, ideally, what you have here is not necessarily revolution, although it could be. Come that, we'll talk about that in part 5 of this series. What Locke is describing here, though, can also be applied to elections. What do we do every election cycle? Well, we vote in new politicians. We vote out those who the people, by majority rule, have decided they no longer want to represent them. Or in more extreme cases, that they have violated the trust placed in them as representatives. I can't help but think of Speaker Mike Johnson. A lot of people are really upset with Speaker Johnson. He seems to have abandoned the trust reposed in him. This happens a lot in American politics. The people may be unable, no matter how many elections you have, the people may be unable to vote in politicians who truly act for the public good. So that no matter who you have in office, there's corruption. That's a problem. But elections are a way to formalize this process so that you don't have to have a revolution on a regular basis. No, you can have voting, you can have elections, and politicians who are no longer trusted by the people can be voted out. Thus, Locke says, the community, we the people, the community perpetually retains a supreme power of saving themselves from the attempts and designs of any body, even of their legislators, whenever they shall be so foolish or so wicked as to lay and carry on designs against the liberties and properties of the subject. Again, we'll look at revolution, because here Locke sort of turns up the heat a little bit. Language a little stronger in this portion of our passage. And here Locke also has in mind revolution. Hold that thought. The revolution deserves its own separate video. But even with elections, this applies. So that the community may be said, in this respect, to be always the supreme power. This idea of the community or the people is very important in Locke and in intellectual history. It was a concept that was fairly new at the time. This idea that the people, capital P, is a body, as a body can act and has certain prerogatives and rights, and that you can, a little less than a century later, you can have a document, a constitution with "we the people" right at the top. You wouldn't have seen a document like that in the Middle Ages, for example, or even in the early modern period. It was a very Lockean concept. He wasn't the only one to speak of it, of course, or even necessarily the first, but it's the people plays a very prominent role in Locke's system. So that in the second treatise, what we see here is a chain of power and authority. At the top is God, and we looked at that in momentarily in part 3. Locke makes it clear God is the sovereign. And he's not just saying that. He meant it very, very sincerely. He was a fairly devout man. He wasn't a totally secular thinker. God is at the top. God created natural law. And so these two elements are supreme above all other things, including supreme over the people. The people can't just decide they want to subvert natural law, God's law, and get away with it. No, there would be a judge who would judge them accordingly, a higher power who would judge them accordingly. These two powers are immutable and are completely out of the hands of the people. These are the two supreme powers. However, directly below that in Locke's framework is the people. The people. Note here, we do not yet have, in this chain of power and authority, we do not yet have a governmental body, an institution of government. God, natural law, then the people, and then we have the legislative power. The legislative power is subordinate to the people, to natural law, and by extension, to God himself. And then below that, then you have the executive. Now, the executive, actually, if you look at like tyrannies and authoritarian governments, they have it all backwards. They'll deny God. Many of them are atheists, like communistic governments. But they'll put supreme power in the executive. And the executive rules with an iron fist. In Locke's system, the executive is at the bottom of this chain. Nevertheless, the executive has real power and real authority even under Locke's system. The executive is necessary to civil government, Locke explains. It's necessary as the, quote, executor of the laws. But it's also necessary where discretion is required. Locke explains there are many things, quote, which law can by no means provide for, and those must necessarily be left to the discretion of him that has the executive power in his hands, to be ordered by him as the public good and advantage shall require. Nay, it is fit that the laws themselves should in some cases give way to the executive power. One example of this would be prosecutorial discretion. The Attorney General is under the executive branch. Whether or not the state should prosecute a case, that is up to the Attorney General and the executive. If the legislature, if the Congress, or the state legislature had to vote every single time whether or not to pursue a criminal case or whatever, you couldn't do that. It's not possible. So you leave those powers and that discretionary power to the executive branch. This power to act according to discretion for the public good, so there's the limitation, of course, naturally, without the prescription of law, is that which is called prerogative. Now, prerogative is a word we don't really use much anymore. It's associated with royalty, but very much, modern executives, including the President of the United States, this concept still prevails. Executive prerogative, executive discretion. For since in some governments, the lawmaking power is not always in being, it's not always in session, or it's often too numerous or too slow for the dispatch requisite to execution, and because also it is impossible to foresee, and so by laws to provide for, all accidents and necessities that may concern the public, or to make such laws as will do no harm if they are executed with an inflexible rigor on all occasions and upon all persons that may come in their way. Therefore, there is a latitude left to the executive power to do many things of choice which the laws do not prescribe. A great example of this executive power would be, the fact that the commander-in-chief is the president of the United States. Congress declares war, or they ought to constitutionally declare war. We haven't declared war since World War II. Congress declares war. Congress is also in charge of the funding for the military, the budget appropriation. However, as commander-in-chief, the executive has authority and power over troop movements, for example. How should we attack the enemy? How to prosecute the war? You wouldn't want Congress to vote on each and every different maneuver during the war, obviously. And so you place that authority within the executive branch to act in a way that Congress or any other legislative power never would be able to. The executive power ought to have some latitude. And there are many other examples of this, which Locke sees as a perfectly legitimate power within government. Nevertheless, again, it's subordinate to the legislative power. The legislative power, because the legislative power, it's because the power of the legislative derives from the people. The legislative, as a lawmaking power, is the supreme power. So, U.S. presidents fall under this description. Abraham Lincoln, controversially, suspended habeas corpus. He argued that this was an example of accidents and necessities that may concern the public. I've got to do it as a wartime necessity. The Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime necessity, as Lincoln argued, and so therefore he could issue this proclamation without any act of Congress. Now, eventually, the 13th Amendment was authorized, which abolished slavery, but initially it required executive action, as it's called today. Locke says it's easy to conceive that in the infancy of governments, the government was almost all prerogative, likely. A few established laws served to turn, and the discretion and care of the rulers supplied the rest. But as experience demonstrated that rulers would often abuse prerogative, quote, for private ends of their own and not for the public good, limitations of prerogative were by the people found necessary. And again, the people are a supreme power over the executive. The people, through just experience in history, found you need some limitations of prerogative. Sometimes these kings, there's King William after the Glorious Revolution, and presidents can go too far. And so you need to have these constitutional limitations placed on the executive, both by the legislative, which is supreme over the executive, but especially by the people. And often the people will enact that limitation on executive power through the legislative power, which again is supreme to the executive. So Locke sees, as history progresses, prerogative declines, it appears, in Locke's system, and the power of the legislative increases. Locke emphasizes these two powers, the legislative power and the executive power, both are necessary and both must remain separate. Do not join these two powers. If you do, you're going to run into a whole host of problems. Why? Because to join these two powers would be, quote, too great a temptation to human frailty. Here we see a theme that appears over and over in this series, Foundations of Western Political Thought. Human nature is going to be too great of a temptation if you join the two powers. Got to keep them separate. This is one of the problems with the administrative state as it's evolved since the progressive era in the early 20th century. The administrative state is housed technically within the executive branch Congress has delegated away lawmaking authority to these executive agencies, and then those agencies, those administrative agencies within the executive branch, become almost a branch unto themselves. Permanent Washington, you could say. So that again, Congress has delegated lawmaking authority away to some of these agencies, and the argument is, well, the world is too complex now, and so we can't regulate everything that we want to regulate. Let's give that authority to these agencies. And then the bureaucracy becomes so entrenched that even if you change the executive, I mean, we have an election every 4 years, even if you change the executive, you can have a very, very, very difficult time changing the composition of these agencies, so that the administrative bureaucracy functions like a fourth branch of government, which is very dangerous because it is completely unaccountable to the people. That's an interesting subject. Now, that's way beyond what anything Locke is talking about here, but it's related to, in this sense, the administrative state is a sort of combining of the legislative and executive powers into a new fourth branch that has no accountability to the people, or very little accountability to the people, if any at all. So are the people in the United States truly supreme? Good question. Something to ponder. Locke says, keep these two powers separate. Don't combine them. Because these two powers must remain separate. Separation of powers. Locke says that absolute monarchies, there's Louis XVI, dictatorships are, quote, inconsistent with civil society, and so can be no form of civil government at all. A dictatorship is not even a civil government. It's something entirely different. In such states, the people are, quote, slave of an absolute prince. Their property, quote, invaded by the will and order of the monarch. No opportunity whatsoever to appeal. That's not true civil government, Locke explains. You need a legislative that is separate and distinct from the executive. Now we get into tyranny. What is tyranny? And that will lead us into part 5. Locke says, when the government becomes a tyranny, the people have a right to alter or to abolish that government and to replace it with new government. What is tyranny? Quote, tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to. So you've moved beyond right. When the governor makes not the law, but his will the rule. And his commands and actions are not directed to the preservation of the properties of his people, but the satisfaction of his own ambition, revenge, covetousness, or any other irregular passion. Once you've reached that point, you're looking at a tyranny. Classical tyranny. And tyranny can arise from, it's not necessarily a monarch or even a head of state, an executive. No, tyranny can arise from other institutions within the government. Can even arise from a legislative branch. That's right, the legislative. Even a democratically elected legislative branch can devolve into a tyranny. Locke says, it is a mistake to think this fault is proper only to monarchies. Other forms of government are also liable to it. For wherever the power is made use of to impoverish, harass, or subdue them to the arbitrary and irregular commands of those that have it, there it presently becomes tyranny, whether those that use it are one or many. Are you talking about one president or 465 congressmen or so? 425, whatever. What is the makeup of Congress? I sort of have a memory block there. It's in the 400s. It's a lot, okay? Whether those that use it are one or many, can become a tyranny. Wherever law ends, tyranny begins. That's a great quote. I love that one. Wherever law ends, tyranny begins. Once you have tyranny, now the door is open for revolution. Again, freedom consists of standing rule to live by, common to everyone in that society, a liberty to follow my own will in all things where the rule prescribes not, and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. When it becomes a tyranny, it's no longer a legitimate civil government. This freedom, Locke says, from absolute arbitrary power is so necessary to and closely joined with a man's preservation that he cannot part with it. This is the concept of unalienable rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. What does that mean? It can't depart from you. It's inherent within your person. You can't get rid of it. you don't transfer it over to the government. You don't renounce it upon joining a civil society. No, it remains. You still have these rights. Hobbes said, when the people covenant every man with every man to create the state, they renounce right. They transfer right to the government. Locke says, no. You can't part with these rights. They are unalienable. And if they're unalienable and you have these rights, then tyranny, again, is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to. So, next time, we'll take a look. Part 5, Fighting Tyranny, Resistance and Revolution. Locke has a lot to say about it, and of course, major consequences in the history of our own country, founded on a revolution against tyranny. We'll take a look at that next time. See you then.